because he cares for you. And I thought I'd use that as the title of the lesson this morning, casting all our anxiety on God because he cares for us. We have different anxieties at different times. There are some things that we shouldn't be worried about, that we shouldn't be anxious about, of course. Jesus said in Matthew 6 verse 31, don't worry about what you will eat or what you will drink or what you'll wear for clothing. We don't worry about those things, of course, because we seek first God's kingdom and he'll provide those things. But there are other things that we worry about. Paul, for example, in 2 Corinthians 11 verse 28 said that daily he had the pressure of the concern of all the churches, or the worry of all the churches. So there are some things that we do worry about, others that we don't worry about, but each of us will have different anxieties at different times. And I think one particular anxiety which must be very heart-wrenching is to have a young child who is sick or unwell and you can't do anything to help. That must be a particularly anxious time and a worrying time. I know from experience in our own life, my own life, and I'm sure others with children will realise just how anxious and worrying that time can be. And so I thought today we might have a look at a story of a woman who had exactly that worry about a child that she couldn't help. And I hope today we'll see her great perseverance and faith in the way that she went about helping this sick child. So the passage we're going to look at today is from Matthew 15. You might like to mark your Bible here. We'll come back to this passage repeatedly. Matthew 15 from verse 21. Let's read from verse 21. Jesus went away from there and withdrew into the district of Tyre and Sidon, and a Canaanite woman from that region came out and began to cry out, saying, "Have mercy on me, Lord, Son of David, my daughter is cruelly demon-possessed." But he did not answer her a word. And his disciples came and implored him, saying, "Send her away, because she keeps shouting at us." But he answered and said, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." But she came and began to bow down before him, saying, "Lord, help me." And he answered and said, "It is not good to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs." But she said, "Yes, Lord, but even the dogs feed on the crumbs which fall from their master's table." Then Jesus said to her, "O woman, your faith is great. It shall be done for you as you wish." And her daughter was healed at once. So let's go through this story today and go back to verse 21 to begin with. We're told here that Jesus went away from there and withdrew into the district of Tyre and Sidon. Now I've got a map here that I'd like to show you. For those who are Skyping in this morning, you might be able to look at the back of your Bibles at the maps there. But if we have a look at the general area, then at this stage in Jesus' ministry, he's probably up here at Capernaum, although Capernaum's not shown on this particular map, but somewhere around the Sea of Galilee up here. And then, instead of remaining in the land of Palestine, he heads up here into Phoenicia to Tyre, and eventually goes further north into Sidon, before he comes back down and ends up in Decapolis, and then comes back to the Sea of Galilee. So we're dealing with this area up here now, of course, and we've got a woman who, in the parallel account in Mark 7, is described as a Syrophoenician woman. And you can see Syro, combination of Syria and Phoenicia, coming from this area. This Canaanite woman is a Syrophoenician woman, or a Gentile that comes up to Jesus. So that's the area that we're talking about, outside of Palestine and in the region of Tyre and Sidon. And in the parallel account, we're told in Mark 7 verse 24 that Jesus entered a house and he wanted to escape notice, but he couldn't. So he tried to get away from the crowds at this time, but his reputation, no doubt, had preceded him, and he couldn't get away from them. And so these two towns of Tyre and Sidon, of course, are well known down through the centuries. Way back in Joshua 19, verses 28 and 29, we read about the great Sidon and the fortified city of Tyre. So these were ancient cities, Remember Elijah fled into the region and stopped at Zarephath at the widow's house, Luke chapter 4 verses 25 and 26. Even later on in the book of Acts we find that at Tyre and Sidon there seemed to be Christians eventually. Acts 21, 3 and 4 and 27, 3. So this is the area that Jesus heads into, and notice verse 22, a Canaanite woman from that region came out, or a Syrophoenician woman, a Gentile, as we read in Mark 7, verses 25 and 26. Now you remember as far back as the book of Genesis, Genesis chapter 10, 15 and 19, Canaan had a son who was called Sidon. And Sidon, of course, built a city and named it Sidon, and the Canaanites lived in that general area. The Israelites were to cast out the Canaanites, but in Joshua 17 verse 13, they didn't, and they put the Canaanites to forced labour, but they didn't drive them out completely. So this woman evidently was a descendant from those Canaanites that were not driven out in the time of Joshua. But notice verse 22, how she addresses Jesus. She comes up to Jesus and says, Lord, Son of David. And we shouldn't pass over that too quickly. She says, first of all, Lord, Master. Acknowledges him as the Lord or the Master. But she also calls him Son of David. If you'll go back to the very start of Matthew chapter 1, verse 1, this is a significant description of Jesus. In Matthew 1, verse 1, this very gospel begins the record of the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah. That's how important he is. He's the Messiah. But notice what it goes on to say, the Son of David. This became a term associated with the Messiah, that he would be the Son of David. And so this woman comes up and says, Lord, Master, or Son of David. A significant description. She says to him in verse 22, have mercy on me, Lord, Son of David. My daughter is cruelly demon-possessed. So here's this anxiety that she had, that she couldn't do anything about, a sick child. And she comes up to Jesus and says she's cruelly demon-possessed. In the parallel account in Mark 7, verse 25, she's described as a little daughter. Not referring to stature, of course, but age. A young child, very young child who was cruelly demon-possessed. And it makes me think of that verse I entitled the lesson by, 1 Peter 5 verse 7. Cast all your anxieties upon him, for he cares for you. And this is what she was doing. She came up to the Lord, the Son of David, the Messiah, and she says, my daughter is cruelly demon-possessed. And she wanted Jesus to cast out the demon. Let's go to verse 23. Jesus' initial reaction is a bit of a stun, isn't it? Stunning to us, because he didn't answer her a word. That's a bit of a shock, isn't it? It's not the usual picture that I paint in my mind concerning Jesus. He doesn't say anything to her. And of course, Jesus is not trying to be cruel here or hurtful to the woman. We know on other occasions, in John 6 verse 6 for example, that Jesus often did things to people to test them. Remember when Philip wondered about how they could feed the multitude. Jesus asked him about how they could feed the multitude, and he did that to test Philip. Jesus knew what he was going to do, but he tested Philip. And maybe this is an example of that, where at this stage he didn't answer her a word to develop her faith even further than it already was, because he knew full well what was going to happen as time went on. We don't know why Jesus didn't answer her. I'm only guessing there, but he didn't answer her. But look what the disciples were doing in verse 23. They didn't stay quiet. They came to him and implored him, saying, send her away because she keeps shouting at us. This woman was incessant, was persistent, and obviously knew that if she didn't come in and get help from Jesus, there was nowhere else to go to get this help. And the disciples were getting a bit narked by this, a bit upset by this. This incessant shouting at us, we don't want it, send her away. That was their reaction to this woman. Then verse 24, notice what Jesus says to his disciples. I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. So he emphasises to the disciples that he has a particular mission that he has to fulfill. And as we look through the Gospels, of course, this was Jesus' mission. He did only go to the house of Israel, except on a couple of occasions where he involved himself with Gentiles. The Samaritan woman is one example, the woman at the well, John chapter 4. Matthew chapter 8, the centurion likely was a Gentile. Remember, he healed his servant, paralysed servant. And now this woman here, this Canaanite woman who was a Gentile, on occasions, you see, he did help out with those who were Gentiles, but his mission was basically to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. When he sent out his disciples to preach the gospel, back in Matthew chapter 10, verses 5 and 6, he told them not to go to the Gentiles, not to go to the city of the Samaritans, but rather go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. That was Jesus' mission. And if you'll turn back with me to Isaiah chapter 49, let's remember that God's ways are always higher than our ways, and God's thoughts are higher than our thoughts. God had a particular plan of how the gospel was going to be introduced to the world through Jesus, and that plan was to go to the Jews first, and then later on the Gentiles would richly share in the blessings of Jesus. And this was in God's mind from the beginning, no doubt, before the world was created, but even as long back as 700 years before the time of Jesus, in the time of Isaiah, we read in Isaiah 49 verse 6, he says, and this is concerning the Messiah, "Is it too small a thing that you should be my servant to raise up the tribes of Jacob and to restore the preserved ones of Israel? I will also make you a light of the nations, so that my salvation may reach to the end of the earth." So God's plan for his Messiah, his servant, wasn't just to raise up the Israelites, the Jews, but also to affect the whole world, all the nations, that God's salvation might reach the end of the earth. But there was a particular way of doing this. God wanted Jesus to go to the Israelites first, and then later on this message would be sent to the Gentiles. While we're in the book of Isaiah, let's cross over to chapter 53. I always find it very interesting that Isaiah 53 follows on from Isaiah 49, the passage we just read. The prophecy that the salvation would come to Jew and Gentiles is now followed in Isaiah 53 by verses like verse 6. Isaiah 53 verse 6, "All of us, like sheep, have gone astray. Each of us has turned to his own way. But the Lord has caused the iniquity of us all to fall on him." The salvation was going to go out to Jew and Gentile. That was the prophecy in Isaiah 49. And now in 53:6, all of us, like lost sheep, will have our iniquities laid on him, and he will bear those sins, Jew and Gentile, you see. And if we go back to Matthew chapter... before we go to Matthew, let's go to John. We go to John chapter 10. Remember, Jesus, while in his ministry to the lost sheep of the house of Israel, also said in John 10 verse 16, "I have other sheep which are not of this fold. I must bring them also, and they will hear my voice, and they will become one flock with one shepherd." Now, sadly, some people who are not taught well in the gospel have misunderstood what Jesus is saying here. I've heard some people say that this is a reference to denominational people that are worshipping in denominations, that these are the other sheep that Jesus will bring with him. Well, no, it's not. Those who are caught up in denominationalism are not worshipping God in spirit or in truth and can't be pleasing to God. No, Jesus is talking here about the other sheep, which of course are the Gentiles. He was sent to the lost sheep of the house of Israel, but the other sheep, of course, are the Gentiles, who will eventually come into the church as well. Jesus was sent in his ministry to the lost sheep of the house of Israel, but after he rose from the dead, remember the message was to go out into all the world and preach the gospel to all creation. Mark 16, Matthew 28 and so on. And so if we go to Romans chapter 10, where this marvellous gospel is heading, of course, is very nicely described for us here in Romans chapter 10 verse 12. "There is no distinction between Jew and Greek, for the same Lord is Lord of all, abounding in riches for all who call upon him. For whoever will call on the name of the Lord will be saved." Notice at the end of verse 12, this is for all who call on him, Jew or Gentile. The start of verse 13, whoever will call upon the name of the Lord will be saved. And that doesn't just mean say to God, I want to be saved. It means calling on the Lord in the way that he has authorised, believing in his Son, repenting, being baptised or immersed in water, faithfully following Jesus from then on, serving him. This is available to all. But if we go back to Matthew chapter 12, at this stage, of course, Jesus says, I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And he tells the disciples this, and they wanted the woman sent away. They'd had enough of her, and Jesus had told them what his mission was. But the woman doesn't give it up. Let's go back to verse 25. Matthew 15, verse 25. It says in the New American Standard Bible here that she came and began to bow down before him. Now that Greek word for bow down is the same one back in chapter 14, verse 33, where after Jesus had walked on the water and saved Peter from sinking into the water and got into the boat, verse 33, those who were in the boat worshipped him, saying, you are certainly God's Son. So this is the word for worship, or bowing down before. And if we go back to Matthew 15, to this woman who came and bowed down before Jesus, in light of what she said before this, where she called him Lord and Son of David, this seems more likely that she's not just kneeling down before him, as you would before a political ruler or someone like that, but this is actually her falling down before Jesus in worship, like the disciples did back in Matthew 14. And what's interesting in Matthew 14, where the disciples worship Jesus and where this woman falls down to worship Jesus, is that Jesus accepts that worship. You might remember back in Matthew 4 verse 10, he said you should worship God and serve him only. And yet Jesus was prepared to accept such worship from others. Of course, Jesus was God in the flesh, and so there was no contradiction at all with what was happening. But isn't it amazing here to see the persistence of the woman? She's not going to give up. Jesus hasn't answered her a word. Jesus has said to his disciples, he's only sent to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. The disciples are fed up with this woman and want her to go. And yet the woman comes and bows down before him and worships him. And again places her petition before him. And that reminded me of Luke chapter 18 verse 1, where Jesus told a parable to show that at all times they ought to pray and not lose heart. This woman's a marvellous example for us. We might have anxieties and worries about certain things. We shouldn't give up or lose heart. We should be persistent in prayer before God and place these things before God. Remember, Paul prayed 3 times about the thorn in the flesh. 3 times. He wasn't vainly repeating things in that prayer. But the answer to that prayer was, of course, eventually no. God will always give us what is best. Either yes, no, or not now. But we should be persistent, just as Paul was and as this woman was, to place before God our concerns, our worries, and not give up or lose heart. In verse 25, she says, Lord, help me. And if we can go back to Psalm 46, we sing Psalm 46 from the Blue Book on occasions, but isn't it a lovely start to this psalm? And well worth remembering in whatever worries or anxieties we might have. In Psalm 46 verse 1, God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Isn't that a lovely verse to have in your mind when you're beset by worries and anxieties and troubles? That the Lord is a very present help in trouble. If we go to the book of Hebrews, Hebrews chapter 4, we're not just talking about material things here, physical things of course, but in Hebrews chapter 4 verse 16. The command here is, let us draw near with confidence to the throne of grace so that we might receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need. Coming to God's merciful throne to find grace to help in time of need. Forgiveness of sins and spiritual help will come from God's throne. In Hebrews 13 verse 6, we confidently say, "The Lord is my helper, I'll not be afraid, what shall man do to me?" That's the kind of help that God can provide. And if we go back to Matthew 15, this is what the woman was asking Jesus, "Lord, help me, help me." And so if we go to verse 26, Jesus says to her, "It is not good to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs." Now that sounds a bit harsh, doesn't it? First of all, Jesus doesn't answer her, and then he says, "If I do help you, it's like throwing things to the dogs." Well, what we need to understand, of course, here is that this word for dogs is not the same word as we find back in Matthew 7 verse 6, where Jesus says, "Don't throw what is holy before the dogs." The word in Matthew 7 verse 6 is the word for those scavenger dogs, the scoundrel dogs, the bad dogs, if you like. Whereas this word is, as we read on, is the word for a pet or a trained animal. A bit like, I think Tammy's here this morning, something like that. So Jesus says, it's not good to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs. And he's not trying to insult the woman, of course, far from it. He's giving her a bit of a handle that she can grasp onto, you see, as she soon will, and show her great faith in Jesus. It's interesting, if we go to the parallel account in Mark 7 this time, the Mark account adds one extra word which is worthy of our notice this morning. In Mark chapter 7 verse 27, he was saying to her, let the children be satisfied first. Now that word first there is not in the Matthew account, but can you appreciate what Jesus is saying to her here? The Gentiles will have their time. Their time is coming. But you feed the children first. So Jesus is implying that God's order will be followed and the Gentiles will be satisfied in good time. But the time now is for the first, for helping the Gentiles. And so if we go back to Matthew chapter 15, if we look at verse 27, the woman doesn't disagree with Jesus. She's not upset with Jesus that he talks about the throwing, taking the children's bread and throwing it to the dogs. She says, "Yes, Lord." She accepts it. She understands it. But notice what she goes on to say in verse 27. She says, "Even the dogs feed from the crumbs which fall from the master's table." And now we've reached what Jesus was probably heading towards. When he didn't answer her to start with, when he gave her the opportunity to think about dogs and tables, now we reach this great point of faith in this woman's life, where she says, "Yes, but even the dogs feed from the crumbs which fall from their master's table." Most of us would know this well, wouldn't we, from experience. Most of us have sometime or other, I'm sure, thrown a scrap to a pet dog that might be around a table or around a meal or a picnic or whatever. So as it is today, so it is back then, of course. And this loving mother says to Jesus that basically you've got so much power that it's not going to affect the children, the Israelites, if you do this for me. The Israelites will still be fed by your ministry. They won't be robbed. They won't be made the poorer by this particular help that you might give me. And that's what she says to Jesus. Even the dogs feed from the crumbs which fall from the master's table. So we reach this climax in this persistent woman's approach, this great faith that she has in Jesus, this marvellous answer she gives him, witty answer, I guess, that she gives him. And notice how Jesus responds to her in verse 28. Jesus said to her, "O woman, your faith is great." Now that little phrase there, "your faith is great," or "great faith," is only found twice in the Gospels. Once to this woman, who was a Canaanite, a Gentile, and the other, surprisingly, to the centurion in Matthew chapter 8, verses 10 to 13. So here are two, the centurion is probably a Gentile. Here are two Gentiles who are described as those having great faith in Jesus. And yet what did Jesus have to say about his own people, about the Jews, and about his own disciples even? Well, in Matthew chapter 14, verse 31, when Peter starts to sink in the water. After he comes out to the boat to Jesus walking on the water, Jesus says, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" Here were people that were with Jesus for several years, had seen his miracles and so on, and still at times had little faith. And now we contrast that with a couple of Gentiles like the centurion and this Canaanite woman who had such great faith. Remember, the centurion said to Jesus, "Don't bother coming to my house to heal my servant, just say the word. Because I'm a soldier in charge of other soldiers and they do what I say, you say the word of my servant." Tremendous faith in Jesus by probably a Gentile centurion. And here again, the woman is the same, you see. Tremendous faith in Jesus. Even the dogs can feed from the crumbs of the table. It's not going to affect your great power if you do this for me. It's not going to affect the children of Israel if you do this for me. And Jesus praises her for her great faith. We're studying the book of Thessalonians at the moment on a Wednesday night, and in 2 Thessalonians chapter 1 verse 3, Paul praises the Thessalonians because their faith is greatly enlarged. When you look at the Gospels and the New Testament, you see people at different stages of faith. Sometimes of little faith, other times of growing faith or enlarged faith, other times of great faith like the Canaanite woman and the centurion. And we'll be somewhere along that spectrum in our own lives. And we've got to make sure that we keep moving along that spectrum, that if we start out with little faith, it becomes greater and greater, that we're heading towards great faith and we maintain that great faith. In Romans 10 verse 17, we're told faith comes from hearing and hearing by the word of Christ. As long as we continue to share together God's word and encourage each other in God's word, our faith will continue to grow. And it should grow. And become a great faith, just like this woman had. Notice in verse 28, Jesus says to the woman, "Your faith is great, it shall be done for you as you wish," and her daughter was healed at once. In the parallel account, Mark 7 verse 29, Jesus said to her, "Because of this answer, go, the demon has gone out of your daughter." And this healing is a bit like the healing that Jesus performed with the centurion servant. Jesus didn't have to physically go there, wherever the servant was. Jesus didn't have to physically go to wherever this woman's daughter was to heal this daughter. And try and picture in your mind what's going on here. Jesus is somewhere in Tyre and Sidon. I don't know where this little girl was with the demon, but here's this little girl with the demon, and all of a sudden the demon gets the message that, right, you're out of there, you're gone. Jesus is not even there. Jesus is with the woman. But Jesus has that power, you see, to cast out the demon from the girl, even though he's not present with the girl. And that demon must have been truly shocked, not even to see Jesus, but to have been forced out because of the great power of Jesus. In the parallel account in Mark 7 verse 30, the woman went back to her home. She found her child lying on the bed, the demon having left. The demon had no choice in the matter, of course. Once Jesus cast the demon out, even from a distance, the demon had to leave. And the girl was cured, and would have been cured instantly, just as the centurion's servant was cured. If you'll turn with me to John chapter 20. Last couple of lessons, we've looked at some of the signs that Jesus did. Last time we looked at the feeding of the 5,000. Today we've looked at this miracle of healing this little girl from a distance. Let's never forget John 20 verses 30 and 31. Many other signs Jesus also performed in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book. But these have been written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name. Many, many miracles, aside from these, many that are recorded in the Gospels, many that he did that should convince us that this is someone special. This is the Son of God. And if we believe in him and we follow him, we will have life in his name. He's no fraud, no trickster. Well, time's just about out this morning, so I thought before we finish this story off, we might quickly go back and have a look at those verses again. And remember some of the things that this woman teaches us. Let's go back to verses 21 to 28 and scan our eyes down those verses again. And remember, as the title of this lesson is this morning, 1 Peter chapter 5 verse 7, let's remember to cast our anxiety on him because he cares for us. Jesus may have been testing her in his initial response, being quiet and then saying that he was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel, and then saying that you can't give the children's food to the dogs. But he led her on to this statement of great faith. She cast her anxiety upon him and she was rewarded. Her child was healed. Let's always cast our anxieties on God, knowing that he cares for us. But secondly, as you look down there, let's admire the woman's persistence. When you've got a group of Jesus' disciples all saying, "Buzz off, we've had enough of you," telling Jesus to send her away, she doesn't give up. She perseveres. And that should be a good example for us in Luke 18 verse 1 again. We should be praying at all times and not losing heart. Don't give up. Imitate this woman and be incessant in praying to God and coming before God. Thirdly, notice that this woman had great faith. Let's make sure that's our aim. Not to have little faith or weak faith, but to have a faith which is growing and developing over time and becomes greater and greater as time goes on. Fourthly, let's remember that signs like this tell us that Jesus is the Son of God. The ultimate sign, of course, was his resurrection from the dead, in fulfillment of the prophecies that predicted this. Let's remember who he is and that he can well and truly fulfill our requests and petitions. And finally this morning, as you look at this account, let's remember that Jesus was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel, but in God's, that's the word I'm looking for, infinite. In God's infinite wisdom, this was the best way of doing things, that Jesus go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel first, he die, rise from the dead, and then that gospel be taken out and spread into the whole world. And we can see now, looking back 2,000 years later, just the great wisdom in that plan for the spreading of the gospel to the ends of the earth. It's a lovely little passage, and we don't have any more time this morning to spend on it. But let's remember that whatever anxieties or worries we have at times, not worries about food, clothing and what we'll wear, of course, we don't worry about those kind of things, Matthew 6. But what other legitimate worries we might have, whether it be about a very sick child or whatever it happened to be, let's remember that we can cast our anxieties on him because he cares for us. Let's remember this woman as an example of perseverance and of very great faith. If you're listening to this lesson, of course, we offer the invitation at the end of the lesson for those who are not Christians to become Christians, as we've indicated during the lesson, by believing in Jesus, repenting and being baptised. Acts chapter 2 verse 38, for forgiveness of sins. For those of us who've already done that, let's examine our lives, as Travis has indicated this morning, and let's examine this woman's approach to Jesus, that we remain faithful and never give up, never lose heart, but grow stronger in faith day by day. Let's ask Carl to lead us in the last song.